"You can't live here unless you join the HOA." Those words hit me like a bucket of cold water on what was supposed to be the start of my perfect lakeside weekend. I hadn't even finished unpacking my car when this woman came storming across the street like she was the sheriff of the entire neighborhood. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched high on her head like a crown, lips pursed so tightly they could cut glass. There she was. The legendary neighborhood busybody, the type people whisper about when they say, "That's a Karen if I've ever seen one." Now, let me back up a little. For months, I had been searching for a quiet escape from the chaos of city life, a place where I could hear birds instead of honking horns, where I could look out at water instead of concrete, and where I could just breathe without feeling rushed every second of the day. That's when I stumbled across this little gem of a lakeside property. It wasn't huge, it wasn't flashy, but it had charm, the kind of charm that makes you imagine summer barbecues, fishing at sunrise, and long nights staring at the stars with nothing but crickets for company. I bought it outright. No mortgage, no debt, just mine. I didn't buy it to live there full time, but to use it as a getaway spot on weekends, and maybe rent it out occasionally. It was supposed to be peaceful, simple, stress-free, but peace is exactly what Karen couldn't allow. The very first moment she saw me step out of my car, she marched straight over, her heels clicking on the pavement like an angry metronome. "Excuse me," she snapped, waving her clipboard like it was a badge of authority. "New residents have to sign up with our Lake HOA. Here are the forms. You'll need to pay dues monthly, submit landscaping requests, and follow the neighborhood compliance code." She shoved the papers into my hands before I could even introduce myself. I glanced down at the paperwork. It was filled with rules, fees, and threats of fines if you didn't comply. It was the kind of document that screamed control, not community. I looked back up at her and smiled politely. "Thanks, but I won't be joining an HOA. My property isn't listed as part of one." The shift in her expression was instant. Her smug smile vanished, replaced by a glare sharp enough to cut steel. Her nostrils flared, her face tightened, and she actually took a step back like I'd just insulted her entire family. "What do you mean you won't be joining?" she demanded, her voice rising. "This entire lake is under our HOA. You don't have a choice. Everyone here pays dues, follows the rules, and gets approval for any modifications. That's how we maintain standards." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "Actually, I checked the county records before I bought. My lot is outside your HOA boundaries. I'm not obligated to sign anything." Her jaw dropped as if I had just spoken another language. "That's not how it works here," she snapped. "If you think you're going to freeload while the rest of us follow the rules, you've got another thing coming. I'll have to report you." I couldn't help but chuckle. The absurdity of it all, this stranger thinking she had authority over me, was almost funny. Almost. "Report me for what?" I asked. "You'll see," she said with a smug smile. Turning on her heel and stomping back to her house like she had just won a battle I didn't know I was fighting. I stood there, holding those ridiculous HOA papers, wondering if this was some kind of initiation prank. But the look on her face wasn't playful. It was deadly serious. That was the moment I realized my peaceful lakeside retreat was about to become ground zero for a war I never signed up for. Over the next few hours, as I unpacked boxes and set up the grill on my deck, I kept catching glimpses of her peeking through her blinds, scribbling things down on her clipboard. Every time I moved a chair, adjusted a light, or even walked to my car, there she was watching me like a hawk. The funny part? I hadn't even done anything yet. My lawn was freshly mowed, my house was freshly painted, and everything about my property was neat and tidy. But to Karen, my crime wasn't about the way my place looked. My crime was that I had dared to say no. That night, as I sat outside listening to the soft splash of fish in the lake, I thought about how surreal it all was. Here I was, a grown adult, financially independent, owning property free and clear, and yet some stranger thought she could dictate how I lived because she had a title, HOA president. I shook my head, laughed it off, and told myself she'd get bored soon enough. But deep down there was a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. People like Karen don't get bored. They get obsessed. And sure enough, the next morning I woke up to the sound of tape being ripped. I opened my front door to find a bright yellow paper slapped right across it. In bold letters it read, "Violation notice, failure to register with Lake HOA, fines pending." I couldn't believe it. She had actually gone through the trouble of printing fake violation notices to make it look official. My first thought was to tear it down, crumple it, and laugh. My second thought was, this woman has no idea who she's dealing with. I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe if I explained calmly once more, she'd realize her mistake and back off. So I walked over to her house, knocked on the door, and waited. She opened it almost immediately, as if she had been standing there waiting for me. "Karen," I said evenly, holding the notice up. "My property isn't part of your HOA. You don't have the authority to fine me. And putting fake violations on my door is harassment. Please stop." She crossed her arms, her chin tilting upward defiantly. "You can say whatever you want. I've lived here for years. I know how this community works. If you don't want to follow the rules, then you shouldn't have bought a place here. I checked the county records," I repeated firmly. "My property is legally outside of your HOA. You're wasting your time." Her eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." She slammed the door in my face, and that's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't just a pushy neighbor. This was a power trip. And I had accidentally stepped right into her kingdom, a kingdom she thought she controlled. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. She started leaving more notices taped to my door. She complained that my boat trailer was parked at the wrong angle. She even knocked on my door late at night, demanding I take down the small string of lights I'd put up on my deck, saying they violated neighborhood aesthetics. Every interaction with her was like talking to a wall that yelled, interrupted, and threatened. And every time I gave the same calm response, "Karen, you don't have authority here, stop." But she wouldn't. In fact, the more I resisted, the more determined she became. It wasn't about rules anymore. It wasn't about property values or community standards. It was about control, about winning, about proving she was right, no matter how wrong she actually was. I had no idea at the time just how far she'd be willing to go. I thought the fake notices and the arguments were as bad as it could get. But then came the day she decided to escalate things beyond neighborhood drama. She picked up her phone, dialed the police, and told them I was refusing to comply with the HOA. And that, my friends, is when this story went from annoying to unbelievable. I honestly thought after the police officer told her she had no authority, that would be the end of it. Most reasonable people, once they're told by law enforcement that they're wrong, will back off, lick their wounds, and maybe gossip about you from afar. But they won't keep pushing. Not Karen. For her, that moment was gasoline on the fire. She had lost face in front of the police, and in her mind, she needed revenge. It started small. At least small by her standards. Every time I walked outside, she made it her business to point something out. If I left my garbage can at the curb for more than a few minutes, she'd be out on her porch yelling, "That's not how we do things in this neighborhood." If I parked my car slightly angled in my own driveway, she'd scribble furiously on her clipboard, as if she was gathering evidence for a court case. She even complained about my grill being too close to the deck railing, as if she were the local fire marshal. I tried to ignore it. I'd wave, smile, sometimes even laugh to myself, thinking maybe if I didn't give her fuel, she'd run out of steam. But Karen thrived on conflict. My calmness wasn't discouraging her. It was driving her crazy. Then she started stepping it up. One morning I came outside to find another notice taped to my door. This one was printed in bold red letters. Immediate action required. It claimed I owed the HOA $500 in fines for non-compliance. She had even forged a letterhead at the top to make it look official. I almost admired the effort she put into this nonsense. Almost. I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash, but later that evening, she stormed across the street while I was grilling. "You can't just throw away violation notices." She barked, pointing her finger at me like she was scolding a child. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice even, "those notices aren't real. You don't have authority over my property. I don't owe you or your HOA anything. This has to stop." Her face flushed bright red. "You think you're above the rules? People like you ruin communities. You bring down property values. You think you can just do whatever you want because you bought a house? That's not how it works here." I set down the tongs and turned fully toward her. "Karen, I own this property free and clear. I pay my taxes, I keep it clean, I maintain it. That's all the county cares about. You have no jurisdiction over me. If you keep harassing me, you're going to regret it." For a split second, I thought she might actually listen. Her eyes flickered like she was processing the fact that I wasn't bluffing. But then her lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, you'll regret it first." The next day, I noticed something strange. My mailbox was open, and several envelopes were missing. At first, I thought maybe the wind had blown them out. But later that evening, a neighbor casually mentioned seeing Karen checking my mailbox earlier that morning. That was when I realized this woman wasn't just being nosy. She was crossing into illegal territory. I considered calling the police, but a part of me didn't want to escalate things yet. I figured if she wanted to keep embarrassing herself, eventually she'd get tired. But I underestimated how much power meant to her. A few nights later, I woke up around 11 p.m. to loud banging on my door. Startled, I jumped out of bed and rushed downstairs. When I opened the door, there she was, standing on my porch in a bathrobe with curlers in her hair, waving her clipboard like a sword. "Your string lights are in violation of our community standards," she shrieked. "Take them down immediately or face further fines." I rubbed my eyes, half in disbelief, half in fury. "Karen, it's almost midnight. You can't just bang on my door in the middle of the night. Go home before I call the cops. You think I'm afraid of the cops?" she snapped. "They're on my side. I've already reported you." With that, she stomped back across the street, muttering under her breath. I stood there staring after her, wondering how someone could be so consumed with controlling others. Sure enough, 2 days later, a police car pulled up in front of my house. My heart sank. I had done nothing wrong, but when a patrol car parks in front of your house, neighbors notice. Curtains twitch, people whisper, and Karen? She strutted out of her house like she had orchestrated the whole thing, which of course she had. The officer stepped out and walked toward me as I stood on the porch. "Sir, we received a complaint from the HOA about a disruptive resident refusing to comply with community rules." Before I could respond, Karen jumped in. "That's him, officer. He's refusing to pay dues, ignoring notices, and violating our neighborhood standards. He's a danger to our community." I held up my hands, keeping my voice calm. "Officer, I'm happy to clear this up. May I show you my property documents?" The officer nodded, and I went inside to grab the folder I'd prepared just in case. I handed it to him, pointing out the section that showed my property was not, and had never been, part of the HOA's jurisdiction. He flipped through the papers carefully, then looked up at Karen. "Ma'am, he's correct. This lot is outside of your HOA's coverage. Can't enforce rules on him." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But that's not possible. Everyone here is under the HOA. Everyone." The officer shook his head. "Not him. Unless you have legal documents proving otherwise, you need to stop harassing him. Continuing to do so could result in charges against you." Her face turned beet red. She stammered, tried to argue, but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, this is not a police matter anymore unless you make it one by continuing this behavior. Do you understand?" She glared at me with eyes full of venom, then turned on her heel and stomped back to her house without another word. The officer handed me back my documents and gave me a sympathetic nod. "Sorry about that. Unfortunately, we deal with this kind of thing more often than you'd think. Some HOA presidents take their role a little too seriously. If she bothers you again, document everything and call us." I thanked him, relieved that logic had won out, at least for now. But as I watched Karen slam her door across the street, I knew this wasn't over. People like her didn't admit defeat. They plotted comebacks. That night, as I sat on my deck staring out at the still water, I thought about how crazy it was that my little escape had turned into such a circus. I had bought this place for peace, but instead, I was living in a real-life drama, starring Karen as the self-appointed queen of the lake. I didn't know it yet, But this battle had only just begun. She wasn't done, not by a long shot, and the next move she made would prove just how far she was willing to go to get her way. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the lake water like ripples of chaos, breaking the calm night into something that felt like a scene from a movie. I hadn't done anything wrong, but when you see a police cruiser parked in front of your house, your stomach drops. There's this weight that presses down on you, like you're guilty even when you know you're not. I stepped outside, trying to keep my face neutral. While across the street, Karen stood on her porch, arms folded, chin raised, looking like a general who had just summoned reinforcements. The officer, a tall man in his mid-40s with a calm expression, approached me. He didn't come in aggressive, just steady, like he'd done this 1,000 times. "Evening, sir. We got a call from the HOA about a resident refusing to comply with community rules." Before I could even open my mouth, Karen stormed over, practically pushing him aside. "That's him! He's the problem! He refuses to join our HOA, refuses to pay dues, refuses to follow community standards. He's ruining the neighborhood and he needs to be dealt with immediately." Her voice carried across the street, drawing out other neighbors. Curtains parted, front doors cracked open, and suddenly I was the star of a show I never auditioned for. People stood on their porches whispering, watching, waiting to see what would happen. I held back a sigh and kept my tone calm. "Officer, if I can show you the property documents, I think we can clear this up quickly." Karen laughed, sharp and shrill. "Oh, please. Don't let him trick you with paperwork. Everyone here knows our rules. He thinks he's special, but he's not. He's a freeloader. He doesn't care about our property values or our community." The officer gave her a look that could silence a barking dog. "Ma'am, let's let him speak." I went inside, grabbed the folder I'd kept ready, and came back out. I handed it to the officer, pointing out the section that clearly showed my lot was excluded from the HOA boundaries. He took his time, flipping through the pages, nodding slightly as he read. When he looked up, his face was calm but firm. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Karen, "according to these records, this property isn't under your HOA's jurisdiction. He doesn't owe you dues. He doesn't have to follow your rules. You can't enforce anything on him." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Karen's face turned bright red, her mouth opening and closing like she was gasping for words that refused to come. Finally, she sputtered, "That's impossible! Everyone here is part of the HOA. He must have forged those documents. He's lying." The officer held up a hand. "These are official county documents. Unless you have something to contradict them, you need to stop." But Karen wasn't ready to give up. She jabbed her finger in my direction, practically shaking with rage. "You don't understand. If he doesn't follow the rules, then why should anyone else? He'll ruin everything. He's destroying the fabric of our community." The officer let out a long breath, clearly running out of patience. "Ma'am, this is not a police matter. He owns his property. He is not under your HOA. If you continue to harass him, this could become a legal issue for you. Do you understand?" Karen's lips trembled as she looked around, realizing her audience was still watching. She wanted so badly to look like the hero, the savior of the neighborhood, but instead she looked like a child being scolded in front of the class. Her hands tightened around her clipboard, knuckles white, and for a moment, I thought she might actually throw it on the ground like a tantrum. Finally, she spun on her heel and stormed back across the street, slamming her front door so hard the sound echoed. The officer handed me back my folder with a sympathetic smile. "Sorry about that. Some HOA presidents take their authority a little too far. Document everything. If she bothers you again, call us. And don't worry, you're in the clear." I thanked him, relieved but also wary. I knew Karen, and she wasn't the type to back down after being embarrassed. If anything, this would make her more determined. As the cruiser drove off and the neighbors slowly retreated back inside, I stood on my porch staring at her house. The blinds in her window shifted just slightly, and I caught the faintest glimpse of her peeking out. Our eyes met just for a second, and I could see it. The burning resentment, the humiliation, the absolute refusal to accept defeat. That night's sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake listening to the crickets, staring at the ceiling, wondering how far she was willing to go. Would she try again tomorrow, next week? Was she capable of more than just harassment and fake notices? The answer came sooner than I expected. The next morning, I found another piece of paper on my door. This time it wasn't a fake violation notice. It was a typed letter, unsigned, but obviously from her. The words dripped with venom. This is not over. You may think you're above the rules, but this community doesn't tolerate outsiders who refuse to respect order. You can't hide behind paperwork forever. We will make sure you comply. It wasn't just persistence anymore. It was a threat, a vague, unsettling promise that she wouldn't stop until she got her way. I stood there with the letter in my hand, feeling a mixture of anger and amusement. Part of me wanted to laugh at how ridiculous it was, but another part of me couldn't ignore the reality. This woman had already proven she was willing to cross lines most people wouldn't. She'd faked documents, trespassed, even called the cops with false claims. What was stopping her from going further? I decided to be proactive. I installed cameras around the property, motion sensors, night vision, the works. If she was going to keep harassing me, I'd have proof. I also started keeping a journal, logging every interaction, every notice, every time she crossed the line. But the strangest part was the way the other neighbors reacted. Some avoided me completely, like they didn't want to get on her bad side. Others gave me sympathetic looks, quiet nods, little gestures that said, "We know she's crazy, but we're not brave enough to say it out loud." A few even whispered to me in private that they envied me. "We wish we weren't in the HOA," one man admitted, glancing nervously toward her house. "She runs this place like a dictatorship." That was when it really sank in. This wasn't just about me. This was about Karen needing to control everyone. The HOA was her throne, and she wasn't about to let anyone live free outside of it, not without making an example of them. The police officer's words echoed in my mind. Document everything. I knew she wasn't done. She couldn't be, not after being humiliated in front of the whole neighborhood. And sure enough, she wasn't. Because the next time she struck, it wasn't just with notices or yelling or even threats. She went for something bigger, something that would make the cop incident look like child's play. After the police confrontation, I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would back off. But if I've learned anything about people like her, it's that humiliation doesn't teach them humility. It teaches them vengeance. For the next few days, I noticed little things that told me she hadn't let it go. When I left my driveway, her blinds shifted. When I came home, she'd suddenly happened to be outside, watering plants that didn't need watering. Clipboard clutched in her hand, scribbling furiously. If I walked to the mailbox, she'd be watching. If I sat on my deck, she'd stand on hers, pretending to fuss with flower pots, but really just glaring at me like I'd personally declared war on her kingdom. It was exhausting. I came here for peace, for the sound of the lake and the quiet of nature. But instead, I was living in a soap opera run by the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac. And then, one night while I was flipping through property management documents in my office, I stumbled across something that made my jaw drop. I had bought several homes in this lakeside area as investments. Most of them were rented out through a property manager, and I hadn't yet looked closely at who the tenants were. But as I scanned through the leases, cross-checking addresses, my eyes landed on one that seemed oddly familiar. The name on the lease, Karen, last name. The address directly across the street from my lake house. I blinked, reread it, checked again. And then I laughed. I laughed so hard I had to sit back in my chair, clutching my stomach. It was almost too perfect, too ridiculous to be true. The woman who had spent days harassing me, plastering fake notices on my door, calling the cops on me, screaming about rules and dues and compliance. She was my tenant. She was literally living under a lease that I owned. The irony was so delicious I couldn't stop grinning. She thought she was the queen of this neighborhood, barking orders at me like I was some unruly subject. But the truth was, she was standing on land I owned. She was paying rent to me. I wasn't just her neighbor. I was her landlord. For a while, I debated what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to march right over, wave her lease in her face and say, "Guess what? You've been bossing around your landlord." But another part of me wanted to savor it, to wait until the right moment, to let her dig herself deeper before dropping the bomb. So I waited. I let her continue her little war, watching with a kind of twisted amusement. Every fake notice, every glare, every muttered insult, it all became less annoying and more entertaining. Because I knew something she didn't. But the moment came sooner than I expected. It was rent collection week. My property manager usually handled it, but I decided this month I'd take care of it personally. I wanted to see her face when I showed up at her door, not as her neighbor. Not as her victim, but as her landlord. I walked across the street, lease agreement in hand, and knocked. The door opened, and there she was, still holding that ever-present clipboard. She looked surprised to see me, then narrowed her eyes. "What do you want now?" I smiled. "Actually, Karen, this isn't about HOA nonsense. This is about your rent," she blinked. "My rent? What does that have to do with you?" I held up the lease, her signature clear at the bottom. "Everything. Because you see, I'm not just your neighbor. I'm your landlord. This is my property. You live in my house." The transformation on her face was priceless. The smugness drained away in an instant, replaced by shock, then confusion, then horror. Her mouth opened, but no words came out at first. She looked at the lease, then at me, then back at the lease like her entire world had just been flipped upside down. You're lying," she finally stammered. "That's impossible. My landlord is some company." I shook my head. "I own that company. I own this property. Which means I own the house you live in. Which means, Karen, that for all the noise you've been making about rules and authority, you've been harassing your landlord." Her knees seemed to wobble. She gripped the edge of the door frame like she needed it to stay standing. But, I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Do you realize how much power I have over your living situation? One word from me and your lease isn't renewed. One official complaint filed and you're out. Given the way you've treated me, you're lucky I haven't already made that call." For once, she had no comeback. No lecture. No threats. Just silence. Her eyes darted around nervously, as though the neighbors might be watching, as though her entire empire had just crumbled in front of her. "I'll tell you what," I continued, my tone calm but firm. "I'm not unreasonable. I don't care if you want to play queen of the HOA with everyone else. But as far as I'm concerned, you will stop harassing me. No more notices. No more fake fines. No more police calls. Because if you so much as tape another piece of paper to my door, you'll find yourself looking for a new place to live. Do we understand each other?" She swallowed hard, nodded once, then again. Her voice came out shaky. "Yes, I understand." "Good," I said, handing her a copy of the lease. "Now I'll expect your rent on time. And maybe, just maybe, you'll think twice before messing with the person who owns the roof over your head." I turned and walked back across the street, not even needing to look back to know she was still standing there. Stunned. That moment was the sweetest victory I'd ever tasted. Not because I wanted to be cruel, but because the balance of power had finally shifted. She wasn't the queen anymore. She wasn't the one in control. She was just a tenant who'd overplayed her hand. And the best part? She couldn't say a word to anyone about it. Imagine the humiliation of admitting to the neighborhood that the very man she'd been calling the police on, the man she'd been trying to bully into submission, was the same man she was paying rent to every month. Her pride wouldn't allow it. In the days that followed, her behavior changed dramatically. The clipboard disappeared. The fake notices stopped. The glares turned into awkward, forced smiles. She even started waving at me, though it looked more like a grimace than a greeting. The silence was blissful. For the first time since buying the lake house, I could sit on my deck, listen to the water lapping against the shore, and actually relax. And every time I saw Karen, every time she scurried into her house or avoided eye contact, I couldn't help but smile. Because no matter what she thought, no matter how much she wanted control, the truth was undeniable. She lived in my house. She was my tenant, and I had the final say. For weeks after that confrontation, the neighborhood felt like an entirely different place. It was almost as though someone had hit a mute button on the chaos. The blinds across the street still shifted from time to time, but they no longer carried the same threatening energy. The angry glares had transformed into nervous avoidance, and the once ever-present clipboard had vanished into whatever dark corner it belonged. I no longer had to brace myself every time I walked outside, wondering what fresh drama she'd cooked up. Karen had changed. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She had no choice now that she knew the truth. I wasn't just her neighbor. I was the man who owned the very house she lived in. The man who signed the lease papers she depended on. The man who could, with a single decision, determine whether she stayed or left. And for someone who thrived on control, the realization that she'd been standing on ground that didn't belong to her must have been soul-crushing. But here's the thing about people like Karen. They don't give up quietly. They might retreat for a while, but deep down they're schemers. They plot, they stew. And though she'd been knocked down by the revelation, I knew her pride was too big to let it go completely. For a while, she tried to act overly nice, the kind of fake politeness that's more unsettling than the open hostility she showed before. She'd wave stiffly from her driveway, as if forced to acknowledge my existence. She even brought over a plate of cookies one afternoon, though I could tell they were store-bought, probably grabbed from the grocery store in a last-minute attempt to seem neighborly. I thanked her politely, but I didn't eat a single one. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't a real change of heart. It was survival. She was trying to smooth things over, keep herself in my good graces long enough to avoid consequences. And honestly, I didn't mind that. For the first time since I moved in, I had peace. Even if it was artificial peace, it was still better than constant war. But then something happened that changed the game completely. One evening, as I was going through paperwork for my properties, I got a call from my property manager. He sounded hesitant, almost apologetic, and told me there had been an issue with the rent from one of the tenants. When I asked which tenant, I nearly laughed when he said Karen's name. Apparently, she had been late on her payment. Not by a day or two, but by nearly 2 weeks. And when the office contacted her, she claimed she didn't feel like paying on time because she had issues with management. I had to sit back in my chair and take that in. Here was a woman who had been completely humbled, exposed, and silenced. And still, she found a way to try and push back. She wasn't openly attacking me anymore, but she was poking at the system, testing boundaries, trying to see how far she could go before she faced real consequences. And I had a choice to make. I could let it slide, treat it as a one-time thing, and keep the fragile peace. Or I could send a message that even in the quiet, I still held the power. I decided on the latter. The next morning, I walked across the street with a letter in hand, an official notice from the management office about her late rent. I knocked on her door, and after a long pause, she opened it. Her expression flickered between irritation and forced friendliness. "Oh, it's you," she said, trying to smile. "It is," I replied, handing her the notice. "This is a formal reminder. Your rent is late. You have 3 days to pay in full, or we begin the eviction process." The blood drained from her face. "Eviction? But this isn't fair. I've lived here for years. And you'll keep living here," I said evenly, "as long as you respect the lease you signed. That means paying on time. No excuses. No games," she sputtered, shaking her head. "You can't do this to me. You can't just kick me out because of a few days." "Actually," I cut her off, "I can. And I will if it continues. You've made my life here miserable from the day I moved in. I've let a lot slide, but not this. I'm your landlord, Karen. You pay to live here. That's the deal. If you don't hold up your end, you don't get to stay. Simple as that." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't soften. I couldn't. People like her thrived on weakness, on guilt, on manipulating others into giving them what they wanted. I stood firm, and after a moment she slammed the door shut. 3 days later, the payment came through. On time, in full, and after that she never missed another due date again. But the dynamic between us shifted even more after that. Karen no longer tried to play nice. She didn't bring cookies, didn't wave, didn't smile. Instead, she avoided me completely. If she saw me walking down the street, she turned the other way. If we both stepped outside at the same time, she'd rush back inside. It was almost comical, watching the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA reduced to hiding in her own kingdom. And the neighborhood? It improved. Without Karen constantly stirring the pot, the place actually became what I had hoped for when I moved there. Peaceful, quiet, serene. The lake was no longer overshadowed by her drama. The neighbors once cowed by her seemed lighter too, freer. They no longer had to worry about her breathing down their necks about lawn heights or mailbox colors. She still tried to boss people around from time to time, but her words carried less weight now. Everyone knew she'd been knocked off her pedestal. Everyone knew she wasn't untouchable anymore. In a strange way, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She had built her entire identity around control, around being the ruler of a tiny slice of suburbia. And in the end, that empire turned out to be nothing more than rented ground. She'd spent all her energy trying to dominate others, but she never realized she was standing on a foundation she didn't own. I think that's the biggest lesson in all of this. Power isn't about how loud you can shout, or how many fake rules you can invent, or how many people you can scare into submission. Real power comes from substance, from actually owning your life, your choices, your responsibilities. Karen never had that. She had the illusion of control, and when it shattered, so did she. As for me, I finally got what I wanted from the start. Peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop letting other people dictate how you live. When you stand your ground. When you refuse to be bullied. When you take back your space. And yeah, it helps when the universe hands you the sweetest irony imaginable. That the person trying to control you is actually under your roof, paying you rent. Sometimes life writes better stories than any script could. And every time I sit on my deck, watching the sun set over the lake, hearing nothing but the sound of water and the occasional bird, I can't help but smile. Because across the street, behind those blinds, sits a woman who once thought she ruled me, and now, she knows better. And if there's one thing I'll never forget, it's the look on her face the moment she realized the truth. That was the day the queen lost her crown, and I didn't have to lift a finger to take it, because it was mine all along.